Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here today, and as Dylan said earlier, it's a real honour. I'm Gwenllian, and I met Colin for the first time when I was studying at the Department for European Studies at the Cardiff University about a quarter of a century ago. This morning I'm going to be taking the place of Betty George, Dewi Llwyd, Xavier Grasset and Oprah Winfrey, and I'm going to be having a slightly more informal conversation with Colin to get to know him better. Behind us you will have noticed that there's a reel of some very interesting photographs. It's going to be on a loop, so you'll have plenty of opportunity to see those photos more than once. Already Dylan has quoted out of the poem written in your honour by Professor Emyr Lewis, which was published with language. And in his definition of language, the covert law that forms our restless lives, which gives us some sort of segue into your early life in Barry, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about growing up in Barry. Thank you. What kind of household was it? It was a kind, welcoming, musical, Christian home. My grandfather came from an agricultural background, and as many other people in Wales, he moved to the Rhondda Valley to work as a miner, and my father was brought up as one of 13 children, mental and physical cruelty. It wasn't as bad as J.S. Bach, who fathered 20 children, but with 2 wives, I must add, not one that was constantly pregnant. And when my grandfather became ill because of the effects of the coal mines, he moved to live with one of his daughters in the Barry. My grandmother was from Alltwen, and they met and got married. I'm not quite sure when, but it certainly happened in the Rhondda Valley. I was brought up in Barry. My father worked as a planner, not as a language planner, but planning works. He worked in the docks in Barry. And after the Second World War, the docks belonged to British Rail because it had been nationalised, and that's important. There's something else that I'm going to mention later. So he worked very hard from 7 in the morning until about 5 in the afternoon, but nearly every night as a musician he taught musical in Gladstone Road School. He was the leader of Barry Town Silver Band for about 40 years, I think, nearly until his death at 80 years old. And every Saturday morning he would teach the local youth orchestra, Buckle Morgan, in Pontypridd, next door to Ysgol Rydfelen, in the college, the technical college in Pontypridd at the time. And on a Saturday afternoon, and sometimes on long weekends, he would hold concerts in Barry and all over South Wales. And he was also the secretary of the British Band Association in Wales. So he was very, very hardworking, very disciplined. He may have been lacking in humour at times, and maybe lacking in confidence as well. But he was an elder and leader of the singing in the local chapel in Barry, and his involvement in music, he was very authoritative in that aspect of his life. And part of my personality has come from my father in terms of discipline, I think. My mother was completely different. I won't say she was a show-off, but she was a bourgeois, an actress. She was born in Poole in Dorset. Her father died during the First World War, and a man from Barry was forced to go to Poole to rebuild the port there in case there would be a Second World War very quickly after 2018. My grandmother married him She had 2 children, Uncle George and my mother. And when my mother was nearly at the age of starting grammar school, she moved to Barry and went to the local grammar school in Barry and went on to the Women's Training College in Barry and started teaching just before the Second World War. My mother was fun-loving. She was very confident. She could be scarily impolite and cheeky at times. She was mischievous. And I have definitely inherited that aspect as well. Much of my confidence comes from my mother. Her answer to anything that needed doing was, if you're not good enough, nobody would ask you to do it. Don't worry about it, just do it and enjoy. And as a young child, I didn't enjoy. I would sing nearly every day, either in primary school or in secondary school. And for a long time, for about 6.5 years, from 8 years old until 13 years old, every Monday I would go to the College of Music and Drama in Cardiff and would have music lessons with Zoe Creswell. And for the rest of the week in Cardiff, every 3 weeks, I would appear on Gladagan or Land of Song. For those of you who are too young to remember, who don't live in Wales, Land of Song was some sort of light entertainment. Eifr Emanuel was the star of the show, but there was a crowd of about 6 children who would sing and act, including Geraint Jarman and Tanwen, myself, Margaret Morgan, Anne Morgan. So every Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday evening, somewhere in Cardiff, we would be rehearsing, or singing, or acting, or dancing, all day on Saturday in the TWW studio in Pontcanna. We would rehearse, we would know when to sit, when to sing, we'd learn how to avoid TV cables, and then on Sunday afternoon we would come back and for an hour every Sunday evening, every 3 weeks on ITV, on a national channel for the whole of the UK, we would sing and act live on TV. Why am I telling you this? There are 2 reasons. It's because music was very important to my family. I would sing duets with Brian, my brother, for many years in local Eisteddfods and in chapels. And Gwawr Evans, the daughter of W.R. Evans, and Margaret Morgan would also be competing with us in local Eisteddfods and local Eisteddfods. The reason I'm telling you all of this is not just because of the music aspect, but as a very young lad, I would run to catch the train after school to Barrydock Station to come into Cardiff. I would then run to Cardiff Castle for my music lesson, run back to the station, go back to Barrydocks and have my dinner after coming home at 8 o'clock at night. So I was very busy. But the biggest thing it gave me was freedom. Who now would allow an 8-year-old child to travel to Cardiff alone so regularly? And because my father worked at Barrydocks and British Rail, the entire family had privileged tickets, so we were given free tickets 6 times a year, and Brian and myself would go to places like Old Oak Common, Eastleigh, Paddington, Birmingham, engine sheds for train spotting and just to go on the fireplace and just to go somewhere. We had a lot of freedom as young boys. Brian is a little bit older than me, but we were always out. When we were a little bit older, with Alan Jahan, when we were able to go on the tugboats or the pilot boats from Barry, we would go out all day on a Saturday, go down the channel to Lundy Island to protect the big ships that would come into Barry or Cardiff or Newport. And we enjoyed it so much. We had freedom to relax and to take an interest in completely different fields and areas of interest than going to school and having music lessons.
So we must be grateful then that you didn't follow a career as a screen star or on stage. Yes, quite. Thank goodness for that, we all say, as many of us who take interest in language planning, of course. So was this a household then where there was a musical influence, cultural influence, a very cultural life, a religious life? Was it a home where politics was discussed and ideas and philosophy? Not formally, I wouldn't say that. Certainly religiously, yes. My mother was a deacon at Steenhowth Road, and Brian and my mother would go to the English chapel, and my father was a deacon. And like a number of other chapels in Barry, even though people were surprised that people from Barry could speak Welsh, there was a lot of cultural involvement in the Barry area. It was the home of Gwynfor Evans, for example, who was in the same Sunday school as my father. Hundreds of people would come to Barry. One thing I should say about my mother, if somebody were to ask her what she did, she volunteered. What do you do, Mrs. Williams? Oh, I play the piano and I wipe bottoms. What do you do? I'm a teacher in a nursery school with Mrs. Clark between 1952 until she passed away when I was a student. And what's miraculous is that under Dan Evans Barry, who's Gwynfor Evans' father, huge shop in the Barry area, Mr. Hugh Watkins, who's a carpet fitter, would take my mother and the children who attended the nursery school every morning and every lunchtime to Salem Road Baptist. Throw the children into the back of the van and my mother would look after them, of course. By today, that wouldn't be permitted, would it? But that is why I mentioned this morning the importance of the community and volunteers from the bottom up, because people like Hubert Watkins and Dan Evans, of course, and Carl Quintaniel gave of their time to be involved with and to permit the nursery school to succeed and to permit the young children 3 years of age to attend that school. My mother talked about ideas and literature. My father politically was a socialist before the Second World War, and he was jailed in Germany for 4 years, and he came back to support Plaid Cymru, not for independence or for Gwynfor Evans or Saunders Lewis, but the fact that when he was imprisoned, the Catholic Church and the Red Cross permitted prisoners to send letters home once they knew that they were alive. And my father received a letter from his father saying, "Islwyn, who do you think you are? What is this nonsense you're writing? What's this rubbish?" And what happened was that the officers in the Welsh Regiment would refuse to permit the soldiers to send letters in Welsh. So they would create false letters in English, and what they would say would be stereotypical things like this: "The hunt is almost over. I think the fox is fleeing. We shall soon be home with a good bag of games. Love, Islwyn." Well, my grandfather didn't know what to do with that. And for that, my father became a nationalist, because the most important thing to him was to communicate with his parents, because that was not possible. It's interesting, in a way. There's a seedling there of language policy involved even in that story, isn't there? And maybe was that an influence? And as a young adult, and as we've already heard, he went to study geography and politics, which of course are very wide-ranging areas. How do you move from there into becoming a global expert on language policy? Rodri and Meryl would say that I'm doing exactly the same now as I did in 1972. The strongest concept for me is social equality. Not the language, not education, but recognizing every one of our individual abilities to be ourselves. And, of course, in contemporary Wales, that means our identity and our identity in the language. But my mother and I and the rest of my family were keen supporters of rights, if you like, social rights. As a student, I was a member of the anti-apartheid movement. At Swansea University, I was Third World First Secretary because I expected as I graduated that I would go and work in development studies in Africa. And what changed was that I got to know Meryl, fell in love with Meryl. I tried to persuade her to be with me in these organisations to change society, and the clear message from her was, before you try to influence other people, you've got to change yourself. And she was the one who led me to God. Wow, what an important legacy that is, and a very strong foundation for a relationship and a marriage. And really I'd like to quote from a publication that you wrote a few years ago, and I'll quote in the language concordant to what you've just said.
To align myself with the cause of often marginalised and discriminated people, in the hope that recommendations I may draft will be of some utility to the improvement of their quality of life and human dignity.
And yet that takes us back to the moral core, if you like, of what you do. We've heard of Fishman already, and I was going to say in my script that it would be impossible not to make reference to Joshua Fishman. And as he edited your work, there's not many in this audience can say that Fishman has edited their work, but as he edited your work in 1997, he said macro social linguistics is finally coming of age, and he saw you as a representative member of a new generation of academics and language sociologists. So my question for you is, with the work of which critical thinker or academic would you say you are most sympathetic of? When I began my career, and I should say that Glyn was a head of a department, a particularly good head of department who permitted me to follow my career choice and develop my career path and made me responsible for research within the department and mentoring staff and developing postgraduate students. As I began my career, Glyn Williams, who was mischievous, but very, very perceptive, sometimes very lazy actually, by the way, but very, very perceptive. Miguel Strubel in Catalonia, Peter Nelde in Brussels, Maurice Pinard in Canada, and William Mackey at Bavard University, and Meryl and I were very fortunate to spend a very long time in Canada, and we went round to Laval and other areas. So they were in the area in which I work now. They were important, but in terms of core influences, like a number of you, including yourself, Hobbes, Locke, Mill, Marx, Solzhenitsyn. As a pupil, I would say that I was mischievous, disciplined and grateful, particularly during my time at Rutfeilen. But outside of school, when I wasn't on the train, I would read the works of Michel Cholikoff, Royal Froze The Dawn Froze the Sea, Frantz Fanon, Albert Camus. Things that now, as I look back, when you're 14 years of age, you're not supposed to be reading those kinds of things. Saunders Lloyd and Howell on the curriculum. Okay, fair enough. It was a bit boring, to be quite honest, for me when I was younger. International literature and core ideas, particularly anti-colonialism, that was what really interested me. And when I graduated, as I undertook my PhD, I did a master's in African politics with Jack Spence, and I expected to undertake fieldwork in Biafra because the civil war just finished. And so I was involved in lots of areas, in Boubacar Bouleb, and not personally, but his work and so forth. And it was too dangerous for me to travel to Nigeria, to Biafra, to undertake fieldwork. So when I got this scholarship, I was asked, where else in the world would you like to go to undertake this fieldwork? And I decided to go to Canada and Quebec. So there were lots of ideas in the area from different experts, but some more perhaps deep-seated philosophical ideas came from those who were recognised as historical leaders in the area, particularly J.S. Mill, on liberalism, tolerance, etc. I'm sure the audience have learned an awful lot just by that short thread that we've shared, and there's an awful lot to discuss over a cup of tea or coffee or lunch later on. And what strikes me in terms of my own research work some decades ago now is that your work on language, the regeneration of lesser used languages, really sets together the individual and the group together as entities in an increasingly multiple society where there's a need to develop respect, dignity and pragmatism rather than special pleading. So if you were to have to select one policy or one intervention that had an influence, for better or worse, on the Welsh language, what one thing would that be? I'm going to try to think of three. Okay. One, very early on. Decisions of Flintshire, Denbigh and Glamorgan education authorities as they developed primary and secondary Welsh medium schools in the 60s. It was key. They were mocked for perhaps not being successful, but because of the commitment of the staff, let alone the pupils, they did succeed, and they showed that it was possible to have quite a good education in these secondary schools. The second set of policies would be the commitment of Gwynedd Council, Cyngor Gwynedd, to the Welsh language, to lead the way in terms of local authorities from the 70s onwards. And as I mentioned just a little earlier, the future well-being of future generations legislation, not simply because the other policies that education may have gone to one side, not at all, but this really insisted on the attention of the heads of department and the civil servants and the politicians in all departments of government, and it would be now impossible for any head of department to disregard the Welsh language. Perhaps they wouldn't do enough for the Welsh language, but statutorily they have to get to know this area. They have to be involved with Bethan and her colleagues. They have to come to understand that the Welsh language is here to stay and to be increased. And the more electors that suffer or support the Welsh language, then the more these politicians and civil servants will see that the Welsh language and a bilingual society, stroke multilingual society, is of benefit to Wales for two reasons. One, it's different to England, which is important. And secondly, the increasing powers of the Senedd, of the Welsh Parliament, partially rely on a different identity for Wales or for the residents of Wales. And so it feeds the system to see Wales as being something quite different, and therefore the well-being of future generations is very important legislation, I think, and other future similar laws in future. Well, we could continue to talk. I could continue to talk to you for hours on end today, but we do have a very full agenda, so I just want to say that my debt of gratitude and the debt of gratitude of a number of us in this room today is very great to you, Colin, and I'm sure that each and every one of us is looking forward to today's line-up in terms of discussion around innovation and good practice in language policy, and the knowledge that it would be now impossible to make sense of that were it not for your key contribution shaping and influencing this work. So thank you very much indeed, Colin.
And thank you to Mel for choosing the photographs, and to Jeremy and to Maita. But once again, thank you very much to you as an audience for your support, and for many of you for your messages and cards to celebrate this unique occasion. Thank you, Bethan, thank you, Jeremy, thank you, Gwynllian, and thank you to Ellen as well, who will be hosting the panel discussion this afternoon.